Okay, so welcome back to our lecture in Unit 4 on topic 4.4, Maritime Empires Established. This is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, please make sure to go back and watch that and take your notes on that. So the thematic learning objective for this section is going to focus on economics. What I'd like you to learn by the end of this section is to be able to explain the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor systems from 1450 to 1750. Historically, despite some disruptions and restructuring due to the arrival of Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch merchants, existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean continued to flourish and included intra-Asia trade and Asian merchants. Newly developed colonial economies in the Americas largely depended on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems, including the Incan Mita, and introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and encomienda and hacienda systems. So let's start by talking about the restructuring of economic systems in the Indian Ocean. Now would be a good point to reiterate what exactly we're talking about when we say the Indian Ocean. Some students can tend to get lost and think that the Indian Ocean just refers to coastal India, which it does not. So when we begin discussing economic systems in the Indian Ocean, we are referring to East Africa, India, and the islands in Southeast Asia that were part of the spice trade. The Indian Ocean is used to refer to the larger region which borders the Indian Ocean. The arrival of the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch to the Indian Ocean brought both change and continuity to existing trade systems. Here we have the map of Indian Ocean trading powers. You may recall from earlier in this lecture that Swahili city-states, which Vasco da Gama encountered and invaded on his first voyage to India. Well, the Swahili coast is marked in light blue on the map. The Swahili Arabs had a long and rich history of trade, both inland African trade and maritime trade within the Indian Ocean. The Swahili city-state of Kilwa had one of the largest ports in East Africa, and it was a major trade center that connected places as far away as Great Zimbabwe and China. The Amanes, in red on the map, they were a crucial part of facilitating trade for centuries before the Europeans arrived in the Indian Ocean. Their strategic location made them a hub for trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and they were excellent shipbuilders. The Gujaratis, in yellow, were located on the northwest corner of the Indian Peninsula. They produced textiles that were in large demand, and they grew to rival the Omanis as great seafarers in the Indian Ocean. And finally, the Javanese in Southeast Asia were very active in Indian Ocean trade prior to the arrival of Europeans. They controlled the infamous Strait of Malacca and the spice trade which originated there. So how did the arrival of Europeans to the Indian Ocean change existing trade systems? The very short answer to this question is, despite some restructuring, trade in the Indian Ocean continued to flourish after the arrival of Europeans. This slide gives you some very brief examples of how some changes were brought to some of the regional merchants of the Indian Ocean upon the arrival of the Europeans. What is important to note is that the Europeans were often heavy-handed in their dealings with existing merchants and trading ports, but ultimately, the goal was not to destroy the existing trade network. Rather, the goal was to capitalize on it and, of course, control it. Omani Portuguese example to highlight. The Portuguese gained control of the Omani port city of Muscat in 1507 and remained in control there until 1650. The Omanis were engaged in a rivalry over control of trade, and they attacked Portuguese-held Fort Jesus in Mombasa, which is on the Swahili coast, in 1696. They gained control of the fort, and the Portuguese no longer controlled the import trading of Mombasa. So let's talk about the labor systems in the Americas. This next portion of the lecture, it deals with the second historical development, which is a key concept. Newly developed colonial economies in the Americas largely depended on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems, including the Inca Mita, and introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and encomienda and hacienda systems. So this takes us to colonial economic systems, plantations. We are switching gears to economic systems now in the Americas. Spanish Cuba is a good example of the plantation economy that developed in the Americas, which required huge amounts of labor. When the Spanish began using Cuba for the production of sugarcane, they initially enslaved the local native population, known as the Tainos. By the mid-1500s, however, most of the native Taino population of Cuba had been wiped out, and a new source of labor was needed to replace the Tainos and keep up with the growing sugar production. This is when African slaves were imported to Cuba as chattel slaves. The Portuguese colony of Brazil was also a huge importer of African slaves because of its sugar plantation economy. Brazil dominated sugar production in the 1500s, and that production began to shift to the Caribbean in the mid-1600s. The British colonies in North America also relied on chattel slavery for their agricultural-based economies. From 1672 to 1713, an estimated 125,000 African slaves were brought to the British colonies via the Middle Passage. So let's examine indentured servitude in the British colonies. Indentured servants came to the British colonies in North America first through the Virginia Company. The demand for labor in the colonies was large, but many Europeans could not afford the trip to the Americas to fill these labor roles. The Virginia Company solved this problem by allowing potential laborers in Europe to borrow against their future earnings in the colonies to pay for the voyage. Indentured servants would sign a contract agreeing to work a certain number of years in exchange for the voyage to the colonies. Pictured on the right is an indentured servitude contract from the 1800s. It is estimated that more than half of all Europeans to arrive in the British colonies from around 1600 up until the Revolutionary War were indentured servants. Pictured on the left is a notice of newly arrived indentured servants to the colonies. Indentured servitude labor was later surpassed by slavery in the British colonies. That takes us to the Mita system. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, the Mita system was a form of public service in the Incan Empire. All men aged 15 to 50 gave a certain amount of time each year as a form of payment or tribute to work on public projects for the empire. It was important that those working in the Mita system had enough time to tend to their own personal family lives, so labor in the Mita system was regulated so it offered a balanced life for those who had to participate. After the Spanish colonized and overthrew the Incan Empire, the existing Mita system was adapted for the benefit of the Spanish. The Spanish were interested in mining silver, and silver had been discovered in a city called Potosi in what is now Bolivia. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo was sent to Peru in 1569, and he used the Mita system as a way to send native laborers into the silver mines in Potosi. The result of this change to the Mita system was a breakdown of native communities. People fled the new Mita system, and public works, such as roads, began to degrade. The traditional Mita system had been transformed into a new form of coerced labor. Pictured on this slide is an illustration of Potosi in 1553. The mountain shown was home to the infamous silver mine, and was referred to as the mountain that eats men. And that takes us to the Spanish encomienda system. The concept of the encomienda system originated in Spain after the conquest of the Moors during the Reconquista of 1492. Those who conquered Moorish territory were given the right to use the conquered non-Christians as laborers, and in exchange those laborers were supposed to receive certain benefits, namely protection. This system was expanded into Spanish colonies both in the Americas and the Philippines, but it took a much more inhumane form in the Spanish colonies. In Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the native Taínos were in a revolt against Spanish governor Francisco de Bobadilla, who the Spanish crown replaced with Nicolas de Ovanda in 1502. Nicolas de Ovanda is credited with implementing the first encomienda system in the Americas in an effort to quell the Taíno revolt. It was this implementation of the encomienda system that became a new labor system that was more brutal than the original encomienda system from Spain in the Iberian Peninsula. In de Ovanda's system, the native Taínos were forced to do hard labor and suffered harsh punishments or death in event of any type of resistance. The encomienda system in the Americas more closely resembled slavery, while the original system in Spain resembled European feudalism. Encomienda systems in the Americas were the subject of much controversy because of their corrupt nature and harsh conditions. The Spanish crown considered conquered natives in the Americas to be subjects of the crown, and were therefore, theoretically, afforded some protection. Most encomienda systems only lasted a few decades, but they persisted longer in New Spain, or Mexico, and Peru. All encomienda systems in the Spanish Empire were abolished by 1791. We also see the Spanish hacienda system. The hacienda system was one in which Spanish conquerors were granted land to be used for agricultural purposes. Coerced labor was used within the hacienda system. The system was similar to the manorial system of Europe, which we discussed in topic 1.6, developments in Europe. There was usually a large estate home, and then the fields were either crops or livestock, which was tended. The document shown on this slide is from a dispute over lands adjacent to a large hacienda in New Spain in 1569. The livestock from the hacienda was to remain inside the red lines because they had been encroaching on native homes and farm sites, which are the small brown houses outside of the hacienda. So if we compare the encomienda and the hacienda systems, historians have had a difficult time understanding the exact relationship and distinction between these two systems in Spanish colonial America. Arguments have been made that the encomienda system gave rise to the hacienda system, or that these two systems were inherently intermingled. Much like the feudal and manorial systems in Europe, these two Spanish colonial labor systems were distinct, but they also overlapped. The biggest distinction we can make between these two systems lies in the legal proclamations of Spanish crown. Encomiendas were the direct result of a law passed by the crown that granted the right to collect tribute from non-Christians in conquered lands in the form of labor. The haciendas were land grants from the Spanish crown. Many encomiendas and haciendas operated in much the same way, but it was the underlying awarding of either rights to labor or tracts of land that differentiates the two. All right, so for the next focus, the thematic learning objective that we are going to focus on is social interactions and organization. So this is going to be the S in the SPICE-T if we're using that acronym. By the end of this lesson, what I would like you to be able to do is explain changes and continuities in systems of slavery in the period from 1450 to 1750. Historically, enslavement in Africa continued in its traditional forms, including incorporation of enslaved persons into households and the export of enslaved persons to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean regions. The growth of the plantation economy increased the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas, leading to significant demographic, social, and cultural changes. So, looking at continuities in African slavery, forms of slavery existed in Africa and most other parts of the world prior to the transatlantic slave trade that was fueled by European colonies in the Americas. Slaves from West and Central Africa were traded along the trans-Saharan trade routes and in the Indian Ocean trade routes. Many West and Central African societies were slaveholding societies. These slaves were generally captives from outside groups that were warring with one another. These prisoners of war would often be put to work, and this was a common extension of their kinship group. The slaves themselves were not considered property, but whatever those slaves produced was the property of the slaveholder. This is a very different type of slavery from chattel slavery in the Americas. In chattel slavery, the slave is considered property that can be bought, sold, and inherited. The children of slaves in the chattel form are also an extension of that property. This was not the case in the more traditional forms of slavery in Africa. The non-chattel slavery within Africa continued after Europeans began trading for slaves in Africa in the 1500s. This representation of continuity in African slavery, however, it does not mean that the new slave trade between Africans and Europeans did not also bring about changes. You may recall the large procession that Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire took on his pilgrimages to Mecca in 1324. That included over 10,000 slaves. So let's talk about chattel slavery in the triangular trade. You may recall from topic 4.2 the example of the colony of Brazil with the triangular trade. The labor demands for sugar production were so high in the late 1500s to the 1700s that Brazil received about half of all enslaved people brought to the Americas via the Middle Passage during the transatlantic slave trade. The Caribbean region was also a major destination for enslaved Africans because of sugar plantations there as well. The dangerous and demanding sugar plantation colonies were the destination for about 90% of all enslaved people that were taken to the Americas. The other 10% went to North American colonies, with tobacco plantations receiving the majority of imported slaves. The transatlantic slave trade lasted from 1526 to 1867. The key point in discussing changes to slavery through the transatlantic slave trade is the development of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was much more brutal than the forms of slavery found within the African continent prior to the transatlantic slave trade. So let's examine how we see changes in slavery systems. The system of traditional African slavery continued in Africa even after the onset of the transatlantic slave trade, which brought about chattel slavery. So it's important to recognize that chattel slavery did not replace traditional slavery, but rather it was a new form of slavery that affected slaves leaving the African continent for the Americas. The word chattel literally means to a piece of property, and this gives us some insight into how chattel slavery differed from traditional African slavery. Slaves in the Americas, which were part of the chattel slavery system, were stripped of all elements of personhood. They became property. One effect of this notion of slaves not being considered people was that they became disposable. They were literally worked to death on the harsh sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, and were simply replaced with new slaves. This part of the reason why such a huge majority of slaves brought to the Americas were taken to Brazil and to the Caribbean. This slide highlights some key differences in chattel slavery from its traditional form. A major point in the development of chattel slavery in the Americas is that it was based upon race. Anyone of African descent in the Americas was given slave status. And that takes us to the demographic changes in the Americas. In the Americas, the slave trade caused large demographic shifts because of the sheer numbers of people arriving from Africa. In both the Caribbean and South American colonies that utilized slave labor, racial mixing occurred because the Europeans in those colonies typically did not have their families with them. In North America, however, many entire families from Europe came to the colonies, which reduced the instances of racial mixing compared to the Caribbean and Brazil. Additionally, segregation laws introduced in North America also prevented the same demographic shifts that occurs in other colonies in the Americas. So let's examine the social and demographic changes in Africa. Over the course of the Atlantic slave trade, Africa lost about 12 million people. This systematic extraction of people produced long-term negative effects within the African continent, and particularly West Africa. Of the 12 million enslaved Africans that were sent to the Americas, about 10 million came from areas along Africa's west coast. Because younger and stronger men were the targets of slave raids, many societies began to weaken and were conquered by neighboring warlords. The population loss experienced in the areas that were most often targeted by slave raiders caused severe poverty and a halt to social and economic development. For African societies which were directly engaging in the slave trade with Europeans, the effects were a little different. During the active years of the slave trade, these African states grew incredibly wealthy. However, as the slave trades slowed because of both new laws banning the trade and because of new technology that reduced the need for manual labor, these once prosperous states and kingdoms that relied on the slave trade fell into sharp decline. This led to European conquest of many of these weakened kingdoms later on. Overall, the slave trade sent much of West and Central Africa into social and economic decline. When you're done with this lecture, I'd like you to take a few minutes to watch the video in the description. It'll give you a visual as to the sheer number of people that were extracted from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. So go to the description for the link to that video. So now I'd like to talk quickly about King Afonso I of the Congo. These two slides contain an excerpt from a letter to the Portuguese King João III from King Afonso I of the Congo in 1526. I want you to read through the excerpt, which is in your guided notes packet. As always, I want you to read and annotate the letter. And then I want you to go to the next slide. So here's some more about that letter. And then I want you to answer these questions. So in your packet, answer these questions. Number one, what major grievance is King Afonso describing in this letter to Portuguese King João III or King John III? 2, what is the goal of this letter? And 3, what specific concern does Afonso articulate when we previously discussed an effect in Africa of the transatlantic slave trade? So make sure to answer those in your packet after you have read and annotated the letter excerpt on the previous 2 slides. And with that, that is the end of our topic 4.4 lecture. Here are the key ideas for review that I'd like you to write down in a separate notebook apart from your guided notes. You can have these as kind of like a cheat sheet on your test, a quick access point for them. Number 1, European states established trading posts in Africa and Asia. Tokugawa Japan and Ming China, they enacted policies to limit trade and the influence of Europeans. 3, European states' expansion was fueled by rivalries like the Treaty of Tordesillas, the French and Indian War, England's East India Company and India, etc. Benin, the Kingdom of the Congo, and the Asante Empire grew and expanded as a result of European influence in Africa. The Swahili Arabs, Omani merchants, Gujaratis and the Javanese continue to engage in Indian Ocean trade after the arrival of European powers. The Americas saw new labor systems develop as a result of the labor-intensive agricultural chattel slavery, indentured servitude, modified Mita system, encomienda system, and the hacienda system. The transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the growth of plantation economies, and African slavery continued in its traditional form within Africa. As always, make sure you take a couple minutes to watch the Heimler's Topic 4.4 review video. The link to that is in the description. Thank you and have a great day.